This may be the most important book on Atlantis ever written. Almost everything you've heard about Atlantis, whether from Graham Hancock, Randall Carlson, ancient astronaut theorists, or your favorite Lost Civilizations podcast, traces back to this single volume, Atlantis, the Antediluvian World by Ignatius Donnelly. Published in 1882, it was a sensation. It shaped the way the Western world thought about Atlantis for over a century. And it placed Plato's legendary lost continent in the center of the Atlantic Ocean, in the area of the Azores.
You've just come back, if I understand correctly, from a trip to the Azores. Just tell us all about it and why you were there and why you feel the Azores matter.
When you look at Plato's version of Atlantis, is there an area of the world that...
I think there's one place that the sunken Azores Plateau.
The Azores is actually the most likely location of Plato's lost Atlantis.
Book that was published in 1882 that was written by Ignatius Donnelly. Atlantis, the Antediluvian World. It triggered this huge interest in Atlantis, hypothesizing this mid-Atlantic civilization.
This is an original handwritten letter by Ignatius Donnelly, written just weeks after the book was published, and it gives us a little bit more insight into the man himself. So join me as we do a deep dive into Ignatius Donnelly and his book, Atlantis, the Antediluvian World. Ignatius Donnelly was born in Philadelphia in 1831. He moved to Minnesota, went into politics, served as a congressman and a state senator. He was a populist, a reformer, an abolitionist, a man of enormous energy and curiosity, and he was a voracious reader. History, science, mythology, geology, linguistics, archaeology. He consumed it all, and he synthesized it. Donnelly wasn't the first person to revive the idea of Plato's Atlantis. The idea of a lost civilization in the Atlantic goes back centuries, at least as far as 1665, when the Jesuit scholar Athanasius Kircher published that famous map everyone's seen, showing a large island right where the Azores sit today. Earlier that same century, Francis Bacon had used Atlantis as the setting for an ideal society in the 17th century. And just a decade before Donnelly's book, Jules Verne brought Atlantis back into popular culture. In 20,000 Leagues Under the Seas, Captain Nemo takes Professor Aronnax on a walk across the ocean floor, and they find themselves standing in the ruins of a sunken city. Columns, temples, all underwater, lit by a volcanic glow. That scene put the image of Atlantis as a drowned civilization back into the popular imagination. And, to be honest, this is probably where it all started for me. Not even the book. The 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea ride at Disney World. I was a little kid, and the Atlantis part of the ride was my favorite. Maybe even more so than the giant squid.
I believe we've made a startling discovery. These classic ruins could very well be the legendary lost continent of Atlantis. Some scholars theorize that a remarkable civilization was destroyed by a tremendous volcano.
And then this. Charles Berlitz, the author of The Bermuda Triangle and his book, Mystery of Atlantis. I read his books when I was a kid, and they blew my mind. These books are probably the reason I'm sitting here talking about this today. And Berlitz placed Atlantis in the center of the Atlantic Ocean, near the Azores. But one man more than any other built the template that everyone after him followed, including Berlitz. In 1892, Donnelly published Atlantis, the Antediluvian World. It was one of the most widely read nonfiction books of the late 19th century. It went through dozens of printings, and it shaped everything that came after. When Helena Blavatsky wrote about Atlantis and the Secret Doctrine, she'd read Donnelly. When William Scott Elliott wrote his fantastic account of Atlantean airships and dark sorcerers, he'd read Donnelly. When Lewis Spence in the 1920s tried to ground the Atlantis hypothesis in paleoarchaeology, he was building on Donnelly. When Edgar Cayce gave his readings about Atlantis, the framework was Donnelly's. The popular understanding of what Plato said about Atlantis for most people in the English-speaking world has been filtered through this book for almost a century and a half. The following year, in 1883, he published a second book, Ragnarok, the Age of Fire and Gravel. In it, Donnelly argued that the Earth had been struck by a giant comet in prehistoric times. The impact caused worldwide fires, floods, and a period of darkness. He believed the myths about world-destroying catastrophes found in cultures around the globe were memories of this comet impact. A comet impact causing global catastrophe and the destruction of an earlier civilization in 1883, over a century before the Younger Dryas impact hypothesis. So if we're going to understand where the modern Atlantis conversation comes from, we have to start here, with Donnelly. Not because Donnelly had all the answers, but because he built the template that everyone after him has been working from, whether they know it or not. Before we get into Donnelly's argument, we should probably start with the actual story. Because most people have a vague idea of Atlantis from movies and TV and podcasts, but surprisingly few people have actually read what the Greek philosopher Plato wrote about Atlantis. And Plato is where it all starts. There is no mention of Atlantis, at least not by name, anywhere in the ancient world before Plato. The story appears in two of Plato's dialogues, written around 360 BCE. In the first one, the Timaeus, a character named Critias tells Socrates a story that's been passed down through his family. It goes back to the Athenian lawgiver Solon, who visited Egypt around 600 BCE and spoke with the priests at the Temple of Sais in the Nile Delta. The Egyptian priests told Solon that the Greeks were like children, that they remembered nothing of their own deep past because periodic catastrophes kept wiping out their civilization and they had to start over each time. The Egyptians, protected by the Nile, had records going back thousands of years, and in those records was the story of Athens' greatest achievement, one the Greeks themselves had completely forgotten. 9,000 years before Solon's visit, the priest said, there existed a great island beyond the Pillars of Heracles, which we usually take to mean beyond the Straits of Gibraltar. This island was larger than Libya and Asia Minor combined, modern-day Turkey and North Africa. It was the seat of a powerful empire that controlled the island itself, parts of the surrounding continent, and territories within the western Mediterranean as far as Italy and the borders of Egypt. 9,000 years before Solon's visit, the priest said. So let's do the math. Solon visited Egypt around 600 BCE. 9,000 years before that is roughly 9600 BCE, the end of the last ice age. More specifically, the end of the Younger Dryas period. That date has fascinated people for centuries, and it will matter a great deal as we go further into the story. This empire, Atlantis, launched a massive military invasion of the eastern Mediterranean. They attacked both Egypt and Greece, and it was the ancient Athenians, fighting alone after their allies fell away, who defeated them and liberated the conquered peoples. But then, in a single day and night of terrible earthquakes and flood, the island of Atlantis sank beneath the sea. The Athenian army was also swallowed by the earth, and the sea where Atlantis had been became impassable, choked with mud and shoals. That's the Timaeus version. It's brief, it reads almost like a summary of a much longer tradition. In the companion dialogue, the Critias, the title character goes into much more detail. Critias describes how the god Poseidon founded Atlantis, falling in love with a mortal woman named Plato and enclosing the hill where she lived with alternating rings of sea and land. He describes the island's extraordinary wealth, metals including gold, silver, and a mysterious substance called orichalcum that glowed with a red light. That roughly translates to something like mountain copper. It also had forests and herds of animals and elephants, hot and cold springs, a massive irrigated plain surrounded by mountains, harbors full of ships, temples covered in silver with pinnacles of gold. He describes 10 kings descended from Poseidon, ruling 10 divisions of the island, meeting every 5 or 6 years to consult on common affairs. He describes a ritual where the kings hunted bulls in the temple of Poseidon with staves and nooses, and slaughtered them and swore oaths in blood and then judged disputes among themselves. And then Plato describes the fall. For many generations, the people of Atlantis were virtuous and wise. They despised wealth and valued character. But over time, as the divine nature got bred out of them through intermarriage with mortals, they became corrupt. Filled with greed and ambition, and Zeus, seeing this, gathered the gods to pronounce judgment. And then the dialogue breaks off right there, mid-sentence essentially. Zeus is about to speak, and we never hear what he says. The Critias is unfinished. Plato either abandoned it or chose not to complete it. That's the story. That's what Plato actually wrote. And everything else in the Atlantis tradition for 24 centuries has been a response to those pages. Now, what did Donnelly do with this? Donnelly opens his book by laying out 13 propositions that he intends to prove. And the way he structures them is worth paying attention to because it's very clever rhetoric. He starts with the more reasonable. Proposition 1, a large island once existed in the Atlantic Ocean, opposite the mouth of the Mediterranean. Proposition 2, Plato's description of this island is not fable but veritable history. So this isn't wildly fantastic, at least not for the 1880s. Most people then would have at least entertained these ideas. But then the propositions escalate. Atlantis was where civilization itself began. It was the source population for peoples on every shore of the Atlantic. The gods of the Greeks, the Phoenicians, the Hindus, the Scandinavians were all real kings and queens of Atlantis. Egyptian and Peruvian religion both derived from Atlantean sun worship. The Bronze Age, iron manufacture, and the alphabet all originated there. It was the Garden of Eden, it was Olympus, it was Asgard. By Proposition 11, he's arguing that essentially all human civilization radiates from a single Atlantic source. And, if you've been nodding along with the first few propositions, you're probably getting carried along toward the more extraordinary ones by sheer momentum. Donnelly was a lawyer and a politician. He knew how to build an argument. The heart of Donnelly's case is Plato. He tells the reader he's going to present Plato's account in full. Remember that phrase, because when we go back to the original sources in the next episode, we're going to find that Donnelly left some things out. Some pretty significant things, and what he left out changes the picture considerably. One of the more dramatic elements of Plato's story, of course, is that the island of Atlantis sank beneath the waves in a single day and night. And Donnelly argues that this proposition is not as unlikely as it might sound. And in 1882, Donnelly's geological argument was taken more or less seriously, and with good reason. His basic claim is simple. The Earth's surface is not stable. Land rises and falls. Islands appear and disappear. Coastlines change. And these things happen within recorded human history, not just over geological time. He gives example after example. In 1783, a volcanic eruption in Iceland killed 9,000 people and created a new island that subsequently sank back into the sea. In 1819, an earthquake submerged 2,000 square miles of land along the Indus River in a single day. If events like these happen in modern times, there's nothing impossible about an island sinking in a catastrophe thousands of years ago. Then came the Challenger data. In December of 1872, the HMS Challenger left Portsmouth, England, on what would become the most important scientific voyage since Darwin's Beagle. Its mission was to explore the deep ocean for the first time in human history. Over the next 3.5 years, the Challenger crisscrossed the world's oceans. Among its discoveries was something extraordinary in the Atlantic. A massive underwater mountain range, running almost the entire length of the ocean, north to south. Its peaks broke the surface as islands, the Azores, St. Paul's Rocks, Ascension Island, Tristan da Cunha. When Donnelly wrote his book in 1882, this data was only about 6 years old. Nobody fully understood what the Mid-Atlantic Ridge was. All they knew was that there was an enormous underwater mountain range in the middle of the Atlantic with volcanic peaks breaking the surface. Donnelly looked at this data and saw a drowned continent. The ridge was the backbone. The Azores were the mountain peaks. The volcanic deposits covering the ridge were the mud Plato said made the sea impassable after Atlantis sank. Donnelly even cites a member of the Challenger staff who reportedly gave a lecture in London identifying the submarine plateau as the remains of the lost Atlantis. And he wasn't entirely alone on this. Alexander Winchell, a geology professor at the University of Michigan, was also a proponent of things like land bridges, and he provided much of the data that Donnelly drew on for his geological arguments. And so with the scientific knowledge of 1882, Donnelly's interpretation was more or less reasonable. If you don't know about modern geological science, if all that you know is that there's a giant mountain range under the Atlantic surrounded by volcanic activity, a sunken continent is a logical explanation. Today, of course, we understand the Mid-Atlantic Ridge differently. In the 1960s, scientists confirmed a theory that had been proposed decades earlier, but not widely accepted until the late 1950s: plate tectonics. The Earth's crust is divided into massive plates that move slowly over time. The Mid-Atlantic Ridge is where two of these plates are pulling apart, and magma wells up from below to fill the gap, creating new ocean floor. Donnelly was looking at the same ocean we're looking at. He wasn't wrong to be awed by what the Challenger found down there. He just didn't have the tools to understand what he was seeing. And in 1882, with the data available to him, his interpretation was a reasonable one. Decades after Donnelly, in 1947, a research vessel, ironically named the Atlantis, sailed from Woods Hole to the Mid-Atlantic Ridge. The team, led by marine geologist Maurice Ewing from Columbia University, took dozens of sediment cores and made the first seismic measurements of the ridge. What they found was that portions of the ridge had been above water during the last ice age, when sea levels were roughly 120 meters or so lower than today. The Azores would have been larger. Additional seamounts that are now submerged would have broken the surface. There was more land above water in the mid-Atlantic during the Ice Age than there is now. On a follow-up expedition, cores brought up beach sand from significant depth, sand that forms in shallow water, now sitting far below the surface. That's a real finding. A few years later, the Swedish deep-sea expedition under Hans Pedersen pulled cores from great depth in the equatorial Atlantic that contained continental sand, shallow water organisms, and plant remains, material that really shouldn't be at that depth. Pedersen considered several explanations, and he called the mystery not solved. There are explanations for some of those findings that are related to underwater landslides and currents that can bring continental material into the deep ocean. So there are mainstream explanations for it. Today, Randall Carlson cites these studies in his argument for the Azores hypothesis. And the underlying observations are real. The Azores were larger during the Ice Age. More land was above water. Subsidence and sea level rise mean the geography was significantly different than we see today. There were larger islands in the mid-Atlantic, possibly connected by shallow water during low sea levels. That wouldn't be the vast continent Plato describes, but it wouldn't be nothing either. A real place in the real Atlantic that really was drowned by rising seas at the end of the Ice Age. Donnelly also worked through the plants and animals shared between the Old World and the New. The mammoth, the cave bear, the bison, the camel. He looked at fossil remains in India, Africa, South America, and Kansas. The banana, seedless and tropical, unable to survive a voyage through the temperate zone, yet cultivated in the Americas, supposedly before Columbus. Today, we explain most of these distributions through continental drift and the Bering Land Bridge and through early cultural exchange with the Spanish and Portuguese. But the observation that there are biological connections across the ocean is not entirely settled even now. The sweet potato in Polynesia, certain cotton genetics. There are still some real questions, even if Donnelly's answer probably wasn't the right one. Donnelly also compared Plato's specific details to what was known about the Azores. Hot and cold springs, and hot springs do abound in the Azores. Building stone in 3 colors, white, red, and black, and those are the colors of volcanic rock that are found in the Azores. A muddy, impassable sea after the sinking, and the ancients really did believe that the Atlantic was a shallow, muddy sea. So each detail is at least interesting on its own. Donnelly devotes 6 chapters to flood legends from around the world. And there's some interesting context for this. 10 years before his book was published, a former banknote engraver named George Smith was cataloging clay tablets from Nineveh at the British Museum when he realized he was reading the story of Noah's flood, written in Babylonian on a clay tablet centuries before the book of Genesis was composed. His co-workers reported that when Smith realized what he was reading, he jumped up, rushed around the room, and began to undress himself. Smith's translation made the front page of the Times. The Prime Minister was in attendance when he presented it. It proved that the flood stories were older and more widespread than anyone had realized. Donnelly seized on this. If the Babylonian flood story proved that Genesis preserved a real ancient tradition, then maybe Plato's Atlantis story preserved one too. He compiled flood legends from Greek tradition, Aztec, Maya tradition, Hindu tradition, South American and Pacific Island traditions, and he argued that they all pointed towards a single catastrophic event, the destruction of Atlantis. Today, the idea that myths and legends of a flood are nearly universal around the world is a pillar of Graham Hancock's own lost civilization argument. But it was first articulated here by Donnelly in 1882. Whether flood myths worldwide point to a single catastrophic source, as Donnelly believed, or to the universal human experience of catastrophic flooding, or to some combination of both, is still debated in various forms today. Donnelly's method is to accumulate examples and argue that sheer numbers point to a common origin. The alternative view, that floods are common enough in human experience to generate mythology independently, is also reasonable. The argument has been going back and forth for 140 years. One thing worth noting, Donnelly treats the Greek flood of Deucalion as a memory of the destruction of Atlantis. But Plato's own text says the destruction of Atlantis was the third before the great destruction of Deucalion. At least 3 catastrophes separate the two events. Donnelly reproduces this passage in his own book without acknowledging the contradiction. Maybe he was so captivated by the pattern that he was building that he didn't see it, but it's worth noting that Donnelly himself doesn't always take Plato literally. The second half of Donnelly's book is a massive comparative project. Donnelly catalogs similarities between Old and New World civilizations and argues that they all trace back to Atlantis. If the Egyptians built pyramids and the Peruvian built pyramids, then Atlantis must have taught them both. This approach is called diffusionism, and in 1882 it was a mainstream position in anthropology, not a fringe one. The competing view, independent invention, says that societies facing the same problems with the same materials will arrive at similar solutions on their own. A lot like convergent evolution. Donnelly stacks parallel on top of parallel. Egyptian walls that taper inward, Peruvian walls that taper inward, mummification in Peru and Egypt and the Canary Islands, a 365-day calendar with 5 extra days in both Mexico and Egypt. Most of these can be explained by convergent development, but without archaeological context and modern dating techniques, it makes for a compelling argument. His most memorable argument is about names. Atlas, the Greek Titan, the Atlas Mountains in North Africa, the Atlantes, a people Herodotus places near those mountains, Atlan, a town in Central America, Aztlan, the legendary homeland of the Aztecs, the Atlantic Ocean between them. Most linguists would say these are coincidences from different language families, the similar sounds in the Old World and the New. But to be fair, the etymology of the name Atlas is actually somewhat contested, and place names are the most durable elements in any language. But 1 or 2 similar words is not enough to argue that languages from completely different linguistic groups have a common origin. It takes numerous convergences to make that case. Donnelly also compared the Mayan and Phoenician alphabets, finding 13 matches out of 16. It's one of the most striking arguments in the book. But it's also built on a chain of compounding misunderstandings, going back to Diego de Landa, the 16th century bishop of Yucatan, who burned Maya books and then tried to record what was in them. The Abbé Brasseur de Bourbourg later misapplied Landa's work, producing a misreading that would eventually give us the word Mu and a whole separate lost continent tradition. But that's another story. And in fact, maybe we'll do a future episode where we take a look at Augustus Le Plongeon and James Churchward and the lost continent of Mu tradition. But in any case, Donnelly's linguistic arguments here are based on a completely erroneous translation of the Mayan language. Donnelly devotes a chapter to the Bronze Age in Europe. His observation is simple. In Europe, the Bronze Age appears without a preceding Copper Age. Bronze is an alloy made of copper and tin. Logically, people should have worked copper alone before learning to mix it with tin. But in Europe, the archaeological record jumps straight to bronze, as if the technology arrived fully formed from somewhere else. Sir John Lubbock himself concluded that, quote, the art of making bronze was introduced into, not invented in, Europe. Meanwhile, in the Americas, there's abundant evidence of a long Copper Age, including ancient mines at Lake Superior stretching for miles. Donnelly argues that America preserves the earlier stage of metallurgical development that Europe skipped, and Atlantis was the intermediary. He also notes that more bronze weapons have been found in Ireland and Scandinavia than in Italy. If bronze came from the Mediterranean, you would expect the opposite pattern. But those European bronze objects have dates. They belong to the 3rd and 2nd millennia BC. Donnelly's own argument places Atlantis in active commercial contact with Bronze Age Europe, and Bronze Age Europe existed somewhere between 3000 to 1200 BCE. Plato's date is 9600 BCE. Donnelly never addresses this gap. His mythology chapters walk through the Greek ages, and he identifies the land of the gods with the Bronze Age. His own evidence, his own mythology, his own conclusions all point to a civilization that existed during the Bronze Age. Now, to be fair, Donnelly, of course, didn't have access to modern radiometric dating techniques, and the chronology was not as well understood in his day. But still, the Bronze Age is a very long way from 9600 BCE. He holds Plato's date in one hand and his own Bronze Age evidence in the other, and never seems to notice the tension between them. Now, I want to talk about something that deserves a more nuanced discussion. Donnelly is sometimes dismissed as a racist without anyone reading what he actually said, and I think this deserves a more thoughtful response than it usually gets from either side in this argument. Ignatius Donnelly was a staunch abolitionist. He supported voting rights for Black Americans during Reconstruction. He was a progressive populist who fought for the rights of farmers and workers and immigrants. By the standards of his era, he was probably one of the more progressive white Americans in public life. But he was writing in the 1880s within a scholarly framework that was built on racialist anthropology. And this is something that a lot of modern critics miss. The disciplines of anthropology and archaeology in the late 19th century were founded on racialist assumptions. I've had to engage with a lot of 19th century racialist anthropology in my research on pulp writers like Robert E. Howard and H.P. Lovecraft, and I've written on these subjects at some length. Terms like savage and barbarian weren't Donnelly's invention. They were the standard technical vocabulary used by the leading scholars of the day. The framework was baked into the system. Even the most well-intentional individuals operating within that system absorbed its assumptions without even thinking about it. Obviously, this was all discredited long ago, but not until it did a lot of real harm to real people. Now, what Donnelly actually argues in his chapter on race is that Atlantis was multiracial. He documents enormous diversity among Native American peoples and indigenous peoples. He cites the Popol Vuh, describing the original homeland as a place where black and white people lived together. But he also says some other things that are incredibly cringy to a modern reader. He draws on sources that are deeply problematic, including this book, The Pre-Adamites by Alexander Winchell. This is the same Alexander Winchell, the same Michigan professor that Donnelly used as a source in his geology chapter. Donnelly draws from Winchell's data, but fortunately he doesn't follow him to some of his worst conclusions. And I want to say this as a professional archaeologist. I think it's somewhat ironic when modern scholars in my own discipline are quick to point out the racism in Donnelly's work without acknowledging that the racialist frameworks he was using came from our own fields. Anthropology and archaeology built those frameworks, promoted them, taught them in universities. And we have to own that history whether we like it or not, and we need to acknowledge that. That said, if you're a modern researcher engaging with older scholarship on topics like this, whether it's Donnelly or Blavatsky or Churchward or anyone else from this era, reading it doesn't make you a racist, but you do need to understand that racialist thinking was foundational to much of this material, even when it's not obvious on the surface. It's often baked into the assumptions and the language in ways that sometimes aren't immediately apparent. You have to be thoughtful and careful and honest about what you're reading and where those ideas came from. It's a complex subject. Donnelly was complex. People are complex. And the history of ideas is complex. But I've said my piece, so let's move on. The method driving the mythology section of Donnelly's book has a name: Euhemerism. The idea, going back to a Greek writer named Euhemerus around 300 BCE, is that the gods were not supernatural beings, but real human rulers, deified after their deaths. If you've watched my video on the Hyborian Age and the Younger Dryas, you've already encountered this concept. Donnelly applies it to the Greek pantheon, turning Zeus and Poseidon and Kronos into real kings and queens of Atlantis, remembered in garbled form by the peoples they'd once ruled. Donnelly's counter-argument to the then popular interpretation that the Greek gods were personifications of natural forces is interesting. He says it's like arguing that Napoleon never existed because his name means lion of the desert. For example, he takes on the Babylonian story of Oannes, a being described as part fish, part man, who emerged from the sea and taught the Babylonian civilization. If you've watched Graham Hancock's Ancient Apocalypse, you've seen him use this same figure as evidence of civilizing teachers carrying knowledge from a destroyed civilization. Donnelly's reading is simpler. Oannes is a primitive person's memory of a ship from a more advanced civilization. Same ancient source, two different frameworks, 140 years apart. Donnelly also reads the War of the Titans as evidence of real modern weapons, or at least modern for his day. The thunderbolts of Zeus become gunpowder. If Zeus was a real king, then thunderbolts were a real weapon. Donnelly never reaches beyond his own time. His Atlantis has gunpowder and sailing ships. A century later, other writers would look at similar passage and see nuclear weapons. Donnelly never goes there, of course. He's describing a lost civilization that stays within the bounds of the plausible for his era, even if it goes beyond what Plato described. Donnelly ends his metallurgy section with a fun aside that's purely the populist politician. After arguing that gold and silver became money because they were the sacred metals of Atlantean sun and moon worship, he then wonders whether the gold standard, that was a controversial political issue in the 1880s, might yet do more damage to mankind than the practice of bloodletting. The populist congressman from Minnesota never quite disappears behind the Atlantis scholar. Donnelly closes with a chapter called Atlantis Reconstructed. And the Atlantis he describes is probably not what you're imagining. No giant crystals, no flying machines, no psychic powers. Donnelly's Atlantis is a civilization of farmers and sailors and metalworkers. Wheat, barley, cotton, cattle, horses, sheep, copper and bronze and iron, an alphabet, a legal system, ocean-going ships. It's like a Victorian superpower transplanted to the Atlantic Ocean. Donnelly was, in a real sense, a 19th century Graham Hancock. Both synthesized an existing tradition with the best available evidence in their era, even if they went well beyond mainstream interpretations. Both wrote massive bestsellers that defined the conversation for a generation. Both attracted enormous popular audiences and the deep suspicion of the academic establishment. Donnelly had his Challenger data, Hancock has his Younger Dryas impact hypothesis. Donnelly ends his book with an image. He says that a single engraved Atlantean tablet dredged up from the seafloor would be worth more to science, would more strike the imagination of mankind than all the gold of Peru, all the monuments of Egypt, and all the terracotta fragments gathered from the great libraries of Mesopotamia. 140 years later, nobody's found that tablet. But people are still looking, and I think Donnelly would have liked that. Now, before we go, I want to show you something from my collection. This is a handwritten letter from Ignatius Donnelly, dated April 29, 1882, just weeks after the book was published. It's addressed to Jansen McClurg and Company in Chicago, who published a literary journal called The Dial. Here's what this letter says. Enclosed, find check for $1.50 for 1 year's subscription to The Dial. I was much pleased with Professor Winchell's article in your April number, reviewing my book Atlantis, which I suppose you have on sale. Winchell, Alexander Winchell, the same geology professor whose book Pre-Adamites we looked at earlier, the man Donnelly relied on as one of his major sources for both his geology chapter and his chapter on race. Winchell didn't just get cited by Donnelly, Winchell reviewed his book. And I actually tracked down that review. Winchell called it a, quote, highly attractive book that, quote, will command attention and arouse discussion. He said that the argument, quote, possesses a marked degree of plausibility and was conducted with alertness and good judgment, and braced by the results of extensive research. But, as you can imagine, he had reservations. He noted that many would regard the ideas as exaggerated, and many would persist in holding the record of Atlantis as a fable. But he didn't entirely dismiss it. This was a geology professor at the University of Michigan giving a measured, respectful assessment of a book about Atlantis. That tells you something about where Donnelly stood, at least in 1882. He wasn't a crank shouting into the void. The scientific establishment was actually listening. They had questions for sure, but they were listening. A year later, when Donnelly published Ragnarok with its comet impact theory, Winchell would be far less generous. But in April of 1882, the relationship between Donnelly and the scientific mainstream was at least politely neutral. And Donnelly read that review, and he was pleased, and he subscribed to the magazine for $1.50. There's something about holding this letter that changes how you think about Donnelly. You can see the real man here, a former congressman sitting at his desk in Minnesota, writing a check to a literary journal because one of his main sources reviewed his book and didn't dismiss it. At the end of the day, that's who Donnelly was. Not a visionary prophet, not a crackpot grifter. He was a man who put years of work into something and was genuinely grateful that a legitimate scholar took it seriously. It's hard to reconcile this letter with the way Donnelly gets talked about today, whether by people who treat him as a misunderstood genius or people who treat him as a fraud. He was a man who read everything he could get his hands on, synthesized it with extraordinary skill, and built an argument that, however flawed, shaped how the entire Western world thinks about Atlantis. He was wrong about some fundamental things, especially with the benefit of 21st century hindsight. But the Atlantis template he built in 1882 is still the one everyone is working from, whether they know it or not. In the next episode, we're going to go back to the original ancient sources, especially Plato. Donnelly told his readers he was giving them Plato in full, but he wasn't. And when we look at what Donnelly left out, and we look at other ancient sources that tell a very different version of the Atlantis story, we're going to find something unexpected. If you enjoyed this episode, then please hit subscribe and be sure to let me know what you think in the comments. It really helps small channels like this stick around to have that kind of engagement. So take care, and I'll see you next time on An Age Undreamed Of.